All right, folks, so Suunto is back in a big way with this right here. So this is the new Suunto vertical, and this is probably the most important watch that Suunto has come out with in recent years because it brings a ton of new features that haven't ever been seen on a Suunto before. So Suunto had their 9 Peak and their 9 Peak Pro, which did bring some new features, but the main differences with those were the new case design from the previous generations. But with the Suunto vertical, this brings a lot more to the table than just a new case. They've actually added a lot of substantial new features. So in this video, we're going to go over everything that you need to know about Suunto's brand new outdoor-focused sports watch in just 9 minutes. So I guess without further ado, let's go ahead and get into it. So first off, there's brand new hardware with the Suunto vertical where it has a bigger case than the previous generation, where the vertical has a 49mm case versus the 43mm case on the 9 Peak Pro. And this is how it looks on my 185mm circumference wrist. They did increase the thickness a bit though, where the new vertical is 13.6mm thick, where the 9 Peak Pro was 10.8mm thick. And that was actually one nice thing about the 9 Peak Pro is that it was just so darn thin. But either way, 13.6mm isn't all that bad though, and still very comfortable to wear. And then another thing that you notice is that it does have a much different design than the 9 Peak and the 9 Peak Pro, where they definitely went with a little bit more rugged look to it. And what's funny is that I'm actually a gigantic fan of the design of the 9 Peak and the 9 Peak Pro. I think those are absolutely gorgeous watches where they just have super clean, elegant lines to them. And the vertical, it's definitely a departure where the overall shape is the same, but it now has this texture on the outside of the bezel that just makes it look more rugged. Oh, and then it also comes in 2 different versions. So there's a stainless steel model as well as a titanium model. And both models do come with a sapphire lens. The buttons themselves, by the way, are very similar to the 9 Peak Pro, where they just have an incredibly positive feel to them, and they just have some nice feedback. And it was actually one of my favorite things about the 9 Peak Pro, so I'm stoked to see that they continue that trend with the vertical. And then the next thing we need to talk about is that there's now a solar charging option, and this comes in the titanium model of the vertical like I have right here, but solar charging isn't available on the stainless steel model. So what we have here now is the solar charging panel that's built in that surrounds the display. And what's nice about the solar edition is that, well, it's actually a functional element. Now, the bezel on the 9 Peak and the 9 Peak Pro, well, it was definitely a topic of discussion, I guess you could say, because it was just really apparent. But with the new vertical, they've actually added tick marks around the bezel, which definitely helps distract your eye and make the bezel look a little bit smaller. So next up, let's talk about battery life, which is really, really good here, and that's with or without solar charging. So just using the vertical as a watch without recording any outdoor activities or anything like that, you could potentially get up to 30 days out of it. And if you have enough solar power, you can get up to 60 days, and those are some pretty impressive numbers. And then when it comes to battery life for recording outdoor activities, even with the highest accuracy performance mode, you could potentially record up to a 60-hour-long continuous outdoor activity, and that's using the dual frequency satellite system mode, full heart rate recording, all with 1-second recording intervals. And then you could even get up to 500 hours in their tour mode, where this mode basically reduces the sampling frequency to increase battery life. But get this, in that mode, with enough solar charging, you could potentially get over a year of battery life. So that'd be good enough for hiking the Pacific Crest Trail like twice if you'd like. It's kind of nuts. And that brings us to the next new thing with the vertical is that it now has a dual band or multi-band satellite chipset with a new antenna to take advantage of all that, where it can access 2 different satellite frequencies at one time. And this is basically the latest and greatest thing when it comes to satellite chipsets, where with this kind of technology, its aim is to deliver increased accuracy in challenging environments where satellite signals can kind of get iffy, like around really tall rock faces, heavy tree cover, or around really tall buildings. And then the next new thing to come with the vertical, and this is actually a really big new feature, is that it now has offline maps. And these are basically shaded topographical maps which help add a lot of context to where you are. And they'll show topo information, of course, and they'll also show roads, trails, and bodies of water. And these maps are going to be very similar to what you'd find on something like a Chorus watch, where these are more just like map images of roads, trails, and bodies of water, but they're not like the full routable maps that you can find on a Garmin device. So these won't have stuff like trail names, street names, or any labels or anything like that. But even so, these are still certainly a very nice upgrade. Oh, and then you also do have 3 different map styles that you can choose from. So there's a high contrast mode, an outdoor mode, or a dark mode. And you'll use the Suunto app to manage the maps on your device, where you'll be able to pick and choose different regions you want to have on the watch at one time. And it's not something just like an entire continents or anything like that. You can actually pick and choose much smaller regions to kind of help you manage storage a little bit better. And when you want to download a region, you'll do that over the built-in Wi-Fi on the watch itself. And then the next thing to know is that the vertical has 32 gigabytes of storage for all those maps. Now, you won't be able to load up every single region in the world though with that 32 gigabytes of storage, and that's the same as other watches with maps, but I just kind of wanted to point that out. So for example, I wouldn't be able to load all the US maps on there all at one time, but I still do very much appreciate that they segment out the regions into much smaller chunks like this, where I can just download state by state. Oh, and then one more thing to know about all that storage is that although it does have that 32 gigabytes, it doesn't have the ability to load in music on the watch itself for offline listening, but you still can control the music that's being played on your phone. But what does make those maps even better, as well as just general usability of the watch itself, is that the vertical has a brand new display where it's not only larger at 1.4 inches versus the 1.2 inches on the 9 Peak Pro, but it also has an increased resolution of 280 by 280 pixels versus 240 by 240 before. It's also using a brand new display panel where there's just a lot more contrast than before, and it's also a lot brighter and much more readable. The displays on the 9 Peak and the 9 Peak Pro, well, to be frank, they weren't all that great, where they just lacked a lot of contrast, they were kind of hard to read indoors, and they just kind of seemed dim, and this was kind of a pain point for a lot of Suunto fans out there, so this new display panel is super nice to see. And then there's also a new flashlight function with the vertical. Now, this isn't a dedicated LED flashlight like what's found on the Garmin Fenix 7X or Enduro 2, but they do now have a flashlight function where it cranks up the display brightness on the display itself. One kind of bummer I found out about this flashlight though is that it does automatically shut off after around 30 seconds, and I can't necessarily find a way to change that setting at the moment, so that would be something nice to see. And then another new update is that the vertical now has true 24/7 heart rate recording, where it's actually measuring your heart rate constantly versus before with previous models where it was measuring every 10 minutes throughout the day when you weren't doing a workout. The heart rate sensor does remain the same though, so this is the same LifeQ sensor that was found on the 9 Peak Pro, and if you want details on how that sensor performed, at least on the 9 Peak Pro, feel free to check out my in-depth review of that watch, which I'll have linked down in the description below. And then there's also some new updates to the user interface where there's a new weather page widget sort of thing, which you can access, where these show you the forecast for quite a few days ahead, and then also shows your air quality. So this is just kind of a nice handy tool to have for planning. One thing that has remained the same though is that the UI seems still kind of laggy, and it's just not as snappy as I would like. And I'm not sure if that's something that could be improved over time, but that's something else that I'd like to see. All right, so I've definitely lost track of which number we're on at this point, but let's just go ahead and keep this train a-rolling. So the next new thing is that there's also Strava live segments, and these will basically sync over any favorited segments you have on your Strava premium account over to your vertical, where you'll be able to race against yourself or try to nab that coveted KOM or QOM. And then last up on the things that you need to know is the price, where the stainless steel version runs $629, and then the solar titanium model runs $839. Oh, and then one more bonus item is that the vertical is made in Finland with 100% renewable energy, and they actually plant trees on behalf of the watch to offset carbon emissions, which is kind of cool. So overall, this watch is kind of a big deal, especially for Suunto itself, because they haven't necessarily been making huge splashes in recent years. Their 9 Peak and their 9 Peak Pro are absolutely gorgeous watches and all, but they didn't really bring a ton of new features to the table, which would help them compete with companies like Garmin and Chorus. And so far, there's a lot of things to like about it. I like the larger case size, where it kind of splits the difference with some of the other sports watches that are on the market today, and it fits me pretty well. I did actually like the size of the 9 Peak and the 9 Peak Pro, but having this larger display makes a lot of difference when it comes to usability. And related to that, the display is also so much better than before. And then when it comes to the maps, this feature right here is really what's bringing Suunto back in the game when it comes to competing with companies like Garmin and Chorus. It may not be full routable maps with labels and stuff like that you find on a Garmin, but the maps are still a huge upgrade. But those are just my thoughts, but I also want to hear about what you think about the vertical. So is Suunto back in the game, and does it have enough features to compete? Well, definitely let us all know what you think down in the comments section down below. And if you have any questions about anything I didn't cover in this video, feel free to drop those down there as well. And also make sure to subscribe to the channel for my full in-depth review of the vertical, where I'll be answering the questions of how it actually performs, how it compares, and maybe most importantly, is it worth it? All right, at this point, I have no idea how we're doing on time, but I think that was pretty efficient. But anyway, that's all I've got for you today, and we will see you in the next video.